morning.
Okay. No, nobody could see.
Okay, so I'm going to have a start with our sponsors, and then we'll go into the Gemara for today.
We should be sponsoring today.
Okay.
Shirley, we should be sponsoring today.
All right. Dr. Year of Learning, Dr. Paul Koningsberg, in memory of his brother, Dr. Sam Koningsberg, Shimon Ruven ben Levish, and Ed Goldberg's cousin, Nisan Hara Nisan ben Fardosa. Paula and Bob Bromberg, in memory of their dear friend Julian Smith, Yehuda ben Yisrael. Malka Mann, in memory of her family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov. Sarah bat Ephraim. Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Adia bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Miriam bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Pesel bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, friends of Toby Paris, Sarah Tova bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levi, Malka bat Yosef, friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir ben Shimon, Cheryl Sher, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Arav Akiva, Marcia Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Uriel Paul Federbush, Uriel ben Harav Shimon. A month of learning, sponsored by Haran and Mel Haller, in memory of her mother, Malka Rachel Bas Yehuda Leib, Adina and Michael Kirshner, in memory of their parents, Florence and Nathan Kirshner, and friend Harriet Friedman. Tova and Leo Zimmer, in memory of her mother, Henya Bas Rav Beryl, and her father, Aharon ben Yosef Mordechai. Perry and Jill Meltzer, in memory of his mother, Malka Bas Baruch, and his sister, Golda Leah Bas David Halevi. Carol and Josh Sanborn, in memory of her father, Yehoshua Shia ben Moshe Yehuda HaKohen. Okay. We have, today is the 19th, okay, right? So we have today a day of learning plus Torah Fund sponsored by Marvin and Shirley Weinstein, in memory of his late wife, Ita Bat Avraham, by Stan and B. Monsowitz, in memory of his mother, Rachel Bas Herschel Mordechai. Also have a day of learning by Judy and Ari Cohen, in memory of their friend, Anita Weinstein, and by Bob and Judy Thaler, in memory of his brother, Avram Yechiel Mechel ben David Eliyahu. May the Shamas have an Aliyah, Krank Rafia, Velti Yashir, Shema Tzliah, and L'chol B'nai Yisrael, a good Gaban Shtiar.
Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Zev?
Yes.
Do you think you can stay on the Zoom for about a minute after the shir is finished?
All right.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to go back and have a start really on the bottom of Nun Chet Amud Beis, next to the last line. We found a new Breita, that was clarifying the situation of whether or not we could say anything could be done after the Tamid in the afternoon. Okay, and we saw this machloket as to whether Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael argued as to when additional offerings could be done and what then could follow. Okay, implying that perhaps they could agree that the Korban Pesach could be done after the Tamid, but whether anything else would be appropriately done after the Tamid. Okay, so picking up at that point, the next to the last line, on Nun Chet Amud Beis, Tanu Rabbanan, Tamid Kodem LePesach, okay, that the Tamid was before, right, the Korban Pesach, Pesach Kodem LeKetoret, that the Pesach was done before the Ketoret, the incense, Ketoret Kodemet Lenerot, that the Ketoret was done before the lighting of the lamps, the candles. And this was based on the idea, Yuchar Davar Shene'amar Bo Be'erev Ubein Ha'abayim, that one should put off, so to speak, something in which the Pasuk referred to them in the language of the Pasuk, both evening and afternoon. The davar shelo ne'amar bo ba'erev ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad, as opposed to something in which the pasuk only does not refer to evening, but only to afternoon. Gemara asked, and we saw this at the end yesterday, Ihachi ketoret v'nerot nami nikdemu la Pesach. If that's the case, shouldn't the incense and the candles, the lighting of the lamps, also be before the Pesach? Yuchad davar shene'amar bo be'erev ubein ha'arbayim. Again, applying that principle that we should defer something that is by where the Torah states both evening and afternoon. The davar shelo ne'amar bo ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad, to something in which only afternoon is recited. And the Gemara then answered us, Shani hatam d'mi'et rachmana oto, that there the Torah made a difference because it refers to the word oto, meaning that item, the lamps were to be handled first. The Tanya, as taught in a Braita, me'erev va'ad boker, that it said it would be lit from evening through morning. Tein la midata shetehei doleket me'erev ad boker, such that it would be kindled and continue to burn from evening through the morning. And that's where we ended yesterday. And so we're picking up davar acher, or we might give it a different explanation and suggest the following. Ein lecha avodah shekshera me'erev ad boker ela zo bilvad, that you have no particular aspect of the sacrificial format, let's say, practice, that is valid from evening through morning, other than this one. Mai tama, what's the reasoning? Amar kra, because we have a pasuk, and the pasuk says, Ya'aroch oto Aharon uvanav me'erev ad boker, that you shall, let's say, stretch out or continue this, right? It, right? Aaron and his sons from evening to morning. Oto, it, namely this item, referring back to the Neirot, right? Me'erev ad boker, from evening through morning. Ve'ein davar acher me'erev ad boker, and there is no other item that would be continued, in other words, kept going from evening through morning. Ve'it kash ketoret l'neirot, and the rabbis made a hekesh, between the burning of the incense and the lighting of the lamps. Now, Gemara wants to pick up and say as follows. Vatanya ki kushiyan, and we taught in a Braita when we questioned about this, Tamid kodim leketoret, that the Tamid is before the incense. Uketoret kodemet lenerot, and the incense is before the lamps. V'nerot kodmot lePesach, and the lighting of the lamps is before the Pesach. Based on what? Yuchad davar shene'amar bo ba'erev ubein ha'aravim, the davar shelo ne'amar bo ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad. That again, the principle that we would defer that which is said both regarding evening and, let's say twilight, between the, right, evenings, to something where it is not said except only the aspect of the twilight. So the Gemara questions, but wait a minute. You just got through pointing us that with the word oto, we find that it refers to something that's to be done later because it exists to be done through from the evening through the morning. V'hakativ oto. And so the Gemara answers, V'hai oto mibayele l'ma'ute avoda shebifnim. That reference to oto, to the lighting of the lamps, was required in order to eliminate, okay, that work which was done inside. Okay? My nihu, what example do we have? Ketoret, the example of the incense. Sagadatach amin. Therefore, it's possible, I might have thought the following. Ho'il ukativ ubaha'alot aharon et hanerot bein ha'arbayim yaktirena, that where the pasuk says, as Aaron and right ascends, okay, to bring up or light the lamps at the evening time, let's say, okay, and right proceed then with the incense. Ema nadlik nerot beresha, that he therefore would light the lamps first. Vahadar naktir ketoret, and afterwards he would kindle, let's say, the incense. Mi'et rachmana oto, and therefore the Torah limits us by the word oto. Ela bein ha'abayim yaktirena lamali. If that's the case, then how are we going to understand the pasuk where it says, okay, that the incense is to be done bein ha'arbayim, at twilight time? Lamali, why do we have it there? Hachi ka'amar. This is what we mean to understand, how we need to understand the pasuk. Okay? Hachi ka'amar rachmana. This is how we need. Ba'idan de madleket nerot, at the time of the kindling of the lamps, tehei mektara ketoret, namely that the incense should already be burning. Okay. Now,
From before.
okay. So in other words, it's almost like it's this hekesh that we saw before, means that they're almost to be done parallel.
Simultaneously?
Well, I don't know if they could be done simultaneously.
But the Ketorah, so it seems to be, was a little before the Neros.
Right. So that's the point. Okay. One may have started the, assuming that it was the same Kohen. That's the question. If it were a different Kohen, then fine, it could have been done simultaneously.
Right.
But if it's the same Kohen, he may have had to do the Ketoret first,
And then
then walk over to the menorah, climb up the steps, do the lamps, okay, and so on. Okay? Now, remember, by the way, just as a quick aside, that not all the lamps were lit at the same time. Okay? You had some that were lit, I believe. Okay? Then he could have done the Ketoret. Then he could have come back and do the last two lamps. That could have been a possibility as well. All right. So we pick up now with a new Braita. Tanu Rabbanan, says this new Braita. Ein lecha davar shekodem letamid shel shachar. We do not have anything that precedes the morning tamid, ele ketoret bilvad, except the incense. Shene amar ba. Why? Because in the pasuk we find written the words baboker, baboker. Okay, morning, morning. In other words, each morning. V'yukdam ketoret davar shene amar bo baboker, baboker. and therefore we should proceed with the incense, something that is written each morning. Dichtiv, as it's written, V'hiktir alav Aharon ketoret samim baboker. Because according to the pasuk, it would seem to imply that even though something is done each morning, it implied that Aaron did the ketoret first. The davar shelo ne'amar bo ela boker echad. And therefore that precedes something which is where the word boker is only recited once. Ve'ein lecha davar shemitakev achar tamid shel bein ha'arbayim ela ketoret v'neirot v'pesach u'mechusar kippurim be'erev ha'pesach shetovel shenit v'ochel et pescho le'erev. So we'll come back now. So what is he saying? Okay, that based on this idea that the ketoret could come first beforehand, right? The Gemara continues to tell us in this Braita, right? The davar shelo ne'amar bo ela boker echad. Okay, because it says boker twice. Okay, that would precede. Okay, anything else
It says boker once.
that has the word boker in it only once.
What?
However, ve'ein lecha davar sheme'akev achar tamid. But you don't have anything that is going to delay or hold up, okay, the morning tamid, okay, or basically really the afternoon tamid, except the following: ketoret, right? In other words, what might come after the tamid in the afternoon? One could be the ketoret. V'neirot, a second could be the lamps. Pesach, a third could be the Korban Pesach, or a fourth could be Mechusa Kippurim, an individual who had immersed in the morning, but still had some degree of Tuma on it, and therefore could not be involved in Kodshim, to be able to eat his Korban Pesach until evening. Right? What happened? What did they need to do? Shetovel shenit, because then they need to immerse a second time in the afternoon, and then v'ochel et pischo le'erev, and then they would be able to eat their korban pesach at night at the appropriate time. Okay. Now, Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka omer. He says the following: Af mechusar kippurim b'shar yemot hashana shetovel v'ochel b'kedoshim la'erev. He takes the example of the mechusar kippurim on erev Pesach, and says that's not the only time, okay, that applies. It can apply elsewhere during other days of the year, where he could then immerse himself or herself a second time in the afternoon, and then be able to eat Kodshim, okay, that night. So the Gemara says, Bishlema l'Tanakama. That seems acceptable to Tanakama, the earlier statement in the Braita. Yavo aseh the Pesach. Why? Because the positive commandment of eating Korban Pesach, sheyesh bo karet, that has a punishment if one doesn't do it appropriately, the punishment of kares, excision, v'yedche aseh the hashlama, right? She'ein bo karet, and that would therefore put off the positive commandment of trying to finish and complete all of the, let's say, regular offerings before the Tamid, where that does not have any punishment of karet. Ela Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. But according to the view of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Mai olime dahai asay, mahai asay. What is the importance, significance, okay, of the asay of eating Korban Pesach more than the asay of trying to complete the Korbanot in the course of the day before the Tamid, evening Tamid? Amar Ravina, says Ravina, Amar Rav Chisda, in the name of Rav Chisda. Hacha b'chatat ha'of askinan. Here we're dealing with an example of the individual bringing a chatas offering from a bird. That's what we're dealing about. She'ein l'mazbeach eladama, because the only thing put on the altar from that chatas is its blood and not the meat of the bird, because that's given to the Kohanim to eat. Now, further, Rav Papa Amar, according to Rav Papa, afilu tema b'chatat behema. You might even say that that might apply to the situation of somebody having to bring an animal, a chatas. Ma'aleh u'melina b'rosho shel mizbeach, that a person can bring it up and, I'm going to say, leave it on the mizbeach overnight, okay, and allow it then to be burned in the morning. Okay, but what happens? V'ha'ika asham. Okay, says the Gemara. You gave examples of a chatas, a bird chatas, an animal chatas. What about the example of an asham? Now, bishlema l'Rav Papa, hainu d'malimla. That's acceptable according to Rav Papa, because he said basically you bring it, you put it on the altar, you leave it on the altar overnight, and therefore it's there available to be burnt, okay, after the morning tamid immediately. Ela Rav Chisda, but according to the explanation of Rav Chisda, ma'ika lamema, what are you going to say? Amre, they would say, shekarev ashamo. Okay, that therefore that asham should have been offered. V'ha'ika olah. Okay, fine. So now you say maybe it works for a different kinds of chatas and an asham. But what about an olah offering? Okay, that's totally burnt up. And so the Gemara asks, v'chi tema, if you want to say olah, lo ma'akva, that an olah offering is, okay, that could be brought after the tamid at night, and that doesn't, not problematic. Vahatanya, but aren't we taught again in a Braita? Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka omer, as follows. Omer, keshem shechatato va'ashamo me'akvinoto, the same way that his chatas or his asham, let's use the word holds up, delays, ruins the situation. In other words, one is not then mashlim, okay? Kach olato ma'akavto. So likewise, his burnt offering also is ma'akevet. It doesn't fulfill the asay of hashlama. Okay? B'chi tema, b'shekir ba'olato. And if you want to say that he brought his olah, umi kreva olato kodim lechatato rishon, can we say it's a situation where he brings his olah before bringing the chatat first? Vahatanya, aren't we taught again? Vehikriv et asher lechatat rishona, that one must bring his chatas first, okay, and afterwards he brings the olah. Ma Talmud Loma. What then does the Torah text teach us? Im lelamed shetehei kodemet leolah. It comes that it has to come before the olah. Harei kvar ne'amar. But we already have that said in the pasuk. Ve'et hasheni ya'aseh olah kamishpat. That the pasuk says, and that I'm going to translate it, which will be done second or afterwards, will be the olah according to the regulation. Okay. Elazeh bana'av lekol hachataot. But this then was, in a sense, carried over, all right? Formed a structure, okay, for all the other offerings. Sheyiyu kodmot lechol olot habaot imahem. That they will always come before the olah that comes along with them. V'kaimala, and therefore we hold the afilu chatat ha'of kodemet laolat behema. That therefore, if it's a chatas offering, even only as small, I'm going to say, as a bird, where none of the meat is offered on the mizbeach, okay? Nevertheless, that's to be offered prior to a total burnt offering of an animal.
That animal.
Okay. Now, Amar Rava, says Rava, Shani Olat Mitzorah. There's an exception, says Rava, where the burnt offering of a leper, of a Mitzorah, is different. The Rachmana Amar. Why? Because the Torah therefore says, right, as follows on Nun Tet Amud Al Beis, right? V'ha'elah ha'kohen et ha'olah. Okay. That the Kohen has, in a sense, already brought it up, the olah offering, the burnt offering. Sheha'elah kvar. That it was already brought up. It just wasn't apparently put to the, if you will, put to the fire immediately. Now, Amar le Rav Shemen bar Abba le Rav Papa. Says to him as follows, Rav Papa, lididach, according to your view, the amart ma'aleh umalina berosho shel mizbeach, that you say you bring it up and you, so to speak, leave it over on the top, the side part of the altar. Kaimin va'avdinin milta lekohanim da'atu ba l'dei tikala. Is it possible that we would maintain and do some sort of thing, okay, and expect the Kohanim to do something that might lead to an error or a misdeed? The savre diyomehu va'atu la'akture, that it's possible that they might think that it's due on that day and that they would come then to offer it, right? In other words, to bring the incense then, in other words, and do things in the wrong order, right? Amarle. So his answer, Rav Papa's answer, Kohanim's reasoning. The Kohanim are not just quick, but they're diligent, okay? They're careful about making sure how they order the practices. Okay. Now, Amar le Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahana, Va'amrela, and others say, it was Rav Huna bereid the Rav Natan, the Rav Papa, who said something to Rav Papa. Vaha, kama delo mitkare emorim. But here, what about the fact that when they offer the incense associated with various parts, Kohanim lo matzu achle basar, that the Kohanim then are not permitted to eat from that meat. Titania. Why? Because we have a braita that teaches Yechol yihiyu Kohanim risha'in bechazeh v'shok kodim haktarat emorim, one might have thought, okay, that the Kohanim would be permitted to have the chazeh and the shok, let's say the shoulder or the thigh, before the let's say the incense associated that goes up, raises, okay, associated with the various physical parts, the amorim, of the animals that are actually offered. Talmud Lomar, our Torah teaches as follows: V'hiktir hakohen et hachelev hamizbecha. That the text of the Torah says that the Kohen offers with the incense the fats, okay, on the altar. Okay, what does it mean, the fats? In other words, that there is certain things offered at the same time with the incense, and then other parts, v'hadar, and afterwards, it says, v'haya hachazeh li Aharon ulevanav. Okay, that then the thigh or the shoulder, okay, goes to the Aaron and his son. V'kama de kohanim lo achle basar, ba'alim lo mitkapre. But the Gemara says, but wait a second, so long as the kohanim don't eat from the meat, okay, of the offerings, those who brought the offerings don't gain their atonement. Titania, okay? In other words, if you're deferring, if you're burning this incense with the fats first and deferring, then the Kohanim eating the portions that they're entitled to, at what point do those who brought the offerings gain their atonement? Right? Titania, as taught by a Braita, v'achlu otam asher kiper bahem. Okay, that they will eat those sections by which atonement is gained. Milamed shehakohanim ochlim uba'alim mitkaprim. That comes to teach that the Kohen eat and the owners, those who brought the offerings, have atonement. Now, Amarle, he said to them and responded, Kevan de lo efshar asaum kami shenitma'u osha avdu. Okay? And his answer to him is that where it's not possible, okay, to do it in that manner, we consider it in the same perspective, the same approach as situations where there were those who became tamei, or they lost, okay, the offering, okay. In other words, if we're talking about this delay, okay, that's the situation. Titania, as taught again in the Braita, Yechol nitma'u emorim. It's possible that the sacrificial parts became tamei, o she'avdu, or they became lost. Lo hayu kohanim zakaim b'chazeh v'shok. That under those circumstances, the kohanim are not entitled, I'm going to say, to their priestly portions of the shoulder, the thigh, things like that. Talmud Loma, as the Torah teaches, v'haya hachazeh la'aron u'labanav mikol makom. Okay, but then these things would belong to the Aaron and his sons, regardless. Okay, now Rav Kahana comes to bring us now a new situation. And he does so by bringing a contradiction. Rav Kahana Rame, okay, he brings a contradiction because it's written in one place, Lo Yalim Chelev Chagai ad boker, okay, that one should not allow the fats to remain over, okay, until the morning, fats from the, okay, ad boker, hu de lo yalin, until the morning, one is not to allow it to remain over. Ha kol halayla kula yalin, that would seem to imply that during the course of the night, however, okay, one could allow it to, so to speak, be left over on the Mizbeach. Uktiv. But then we have another pasuk that says, Vehiktir aleha chavei hashlamim, that says that one must offer, okay, the fats of the shlamim offering. Aleh hashlamim kol hakarbanot kulam. And we understand from that pasuk that it's upon these that one must complete the order of all the offerings totally. So on the one hand, it implies that offerings must be finished by Tamid in the afternoon, and nothing can't be left over. The other pasuk implies, fine, it can't be left over till the morning, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be left over part of the night. Okay? So now we see the Gemara tells us, Hu motivla v'hu mefarekla. Okay? He raised the question. In other words, he challenged it and he answered it. Keshenit vat true. Okay? Now, I had a problem with this, okay, to be honest. Okay? In other words, the question is here, okay, at what point was it left over? Did it become nota? All right? And if we look at, okay, I just want us to look at a point. Okay. Okay, on 59b2, okay, Art Scrolls translation. He asked and he resolved. The first refers to where the fats were left over from a sacrifice whose blood was thrown on the altar before that of the Tamid. In that case, they may be burned even after the Tamid. And if you look at note 17 on that page, okay, it has a somewhat lengthy note, okay? Okay, and with a side message, in concluding the present discussion, it is worth noting that some Rishonim maintain that the prohibition to offer sacrifices after the afternoon Tamid does not apply as long as the Tamid was not yet burned. In other words, it is permissible to begin the service of another sacrifice even after the 4 blood avodas of the Tamid have been completed, as long as the sacrificial parts were not yet burned on the altar. Others maintain that once the Tamid was slaughtered, or at least had its blood thrown, it is permitted to begin the service of another sacrifice. So it was a problematic issue there, okay? So in other words, the implication being, Kashin that's something. So they had to come up with the idea of the fats. Okay? But it still bothered me, and I still had a problem with it. Okay, let's come back now. All right? Rami le Rav Papa, Rav Safra, I'm sorry, the Rav. So Rav Safra now raises a contradiction with Rav. Again, of Psukim. K'tiv, it's written, Lo yalin laboker zevach chag haPesach. Okay, implying that one cannot leave over till the morning the Pesach lamb offering. Laboker hu de lo yalin, Hakol halayla yelin. That would again seem to imply until morning it can't be left over,
All night.
but one could leave it over later in the evening, at night. Vaktiv. But again, we have another verse that says, Olat Shabbat b'Shabbato, velo Olat Chol b'Shabbat. Okay, that the burnt offering for Shabbat, okay, must be, I'll say, eaten, observed on Shabbat, but it cannot, but a burnt offering from a weekday, okay, cannot be left over on Shabbat. Velo Olat Chol b'Yom Tov. And a weekday burnt offering cannot be left over on the holiday. Okay. And so therefore, Amar, okay, so that seems to be a contradiction. How would it be possible then, okay, if you had, let's say, the Korban Pesach, and you burnt it, you roasted it, okay, right, on Thursday, right, before it got dark, all right, and you would leave any over till Friday, which would be a weekday, and the Yontif, is that permissible? No, it seems. So that's the problem. Amarle. So he answered them. Far Ramaye Nihale Rav Abba Barchia Rav Abahu. That this contradiction was already presented and, I'll say, discussed, responded to by Rabbi Abba Barchia, by him, and it brought it already to the attention of Rabbi Abahu. Vashanile, and Rabbi Abahu then answered him the following. Hacha, here he says, what were we talking about? Barba'a asar shechaliot b'Shabbat askina. We're talking where the 14th of Nisan occurred, okay, on Shabbos. Dechal ve Shabbos krivinin biyom tov. And what we're dealing here with the fact was that the fats from the Shabbos offering, that is what we're talking about, was allowed to stay over and then be offered on the holiday. Okay, so that's different, he says. Amarle, and he said to him, Mishum dechalve Shabbos, kravinin biyom tov. Since you're saying that the fats of the Shabbos offering can be offered, brought on the holiday, Anan, Niku v'neimale the high kra ba'arba'a asar shechaliot b'Shabbat hu d'chtiv. Are we going to rise and establish that this particular pasuk comes for such a unique situation, I'm saying,
When the 14th comes
where
out,
the condition is such that the 14th of Nisan comes out on Shabbos, and the pasuk was written specifically for that unique situation.
No.
Amarle, he said to him, Shavke lekra, put aside the pasuk. Dahu dachik umokim anafshe. Right? Because the pasuk itself is stressed, is being pushed to the limit almost, and we establish it on its own. In other words, that pasuk needs a unique kind of interpretation to justify what it's saying. And that's how we're going to end that particular piece. Okay. Now we get to a new Mishnah. Okay. To introduce the new Mishnah very quickly, we all remember that we've studied that there are different avodos, right? 4 different steps, right? Quickly reviewing that there's the shechita, which does not have to be done by a kohen, but which probably usually was. Number 2, right? There's the Kabbalah, right? The receiving of the blood in a vessel, okay? Number 3 was the holacha, okay? Transferring, right? Again, by a kohen, just like the Kabbalah, okay? And then number 4 was the spritzing, okay? That was also had to be done by a kohen, spritzing the altar, okay? The mizbeach. So those 4 avodos. And you might remember we learned what happens if there is a situation where the Kohen in any one of those steps, okay, has not mentally intended for it to be for the appropriate kind of offering, okay? That's a situation where we say it could result in pigul, okay, right? It could result in something else, in notar, right? So coming into that whole discussion, both Art Scroll and the Koran have a long discussion, long explanation here about the 4 avodos and everything, because they're assuming that maybe you don't remember that stuff from Chulin and other places. So therefore, if we now come to our Mishnah, Matnitin, says our Mishnah, HaPesach sheshchato shelo lishmo. If for some reason the Korban Pesach was not slaughtered for its intended purpose, and I'm reminding us all what that could be, okay? Remember, the same animal that was used for Korban Pesach was used for Shlomim. Okay, v'kibel, okay, all right, and then they received, in other words, they collected the blood, v'halach, and they transferred it, v'zarak shelo lishmo, and they sprinkled it, not for its intended purpose. Or perhaps lishmo v'shelo lishmo, or perhaps some of the avodas were done for the intended purpose of Korban Pesach, and others were not. O shelo lishmo ulishmo. Or perhaps the earlier avodos were not done intended for Korban Pesach, but then the Kohen remembered, oh, didn't they bring it to me for that purpose? Okay? Pasul. It is invalid. Ketzad lishmo v'shelo lishmo. How is it possible, asks the Mishnah, that it could be done, a situation where it's intent and then not an intent? L'shem Pesach u'l'shem Shlomim. Okay? It could be that it was originally slaughtered, let's say, or the blood was caught for the purpose of Korban Pesach, but as it was being brought to the Mizbeach, the Kohen, who was a different Kohen, okay, from the one who slaughtered or the one who caught the blood, okay, thought, well, maybe this is a Shlomim, okay? So what happened next? Shelo lishmo ulishmo. Well, what about a situation, how could that occur? L'shem Shlomim, l'shem Pesach. Okay, so maybe in that case, it's the opposite, that it was slaughtered for the sake of a Shlomim and the caught for the sake of Shlomim. But again, the Kohen who was bringing it over to the Mizbeach was thinking, oh, gee, it's almost it's the 14th. Okay, maybe the person is bringing it for Korban Pesach.
Oh, I thought we learned right before that Kohanim's Rizim, they're very careful. So if they're very careful, how did they make a mistake like that?
But Kohanim are also human.
Oh, is
Didn't
that
we see
right?
yesterday the fact that some of them were ruffians, right?
Yeah.
That they were tough
But they were still
guys,
Rizim, though.
right?
But they were still Rizim?
Yeah, but what do we say? Zrizim is simply that they were diligent, or do we say that they were quick to do their job? Okay, both. That doesn't mean that, right? So what happens? Asks the Gemara now. Gemara, Babai Rav Papa. Rav Papa asks, Ba'avoda achat tnan. Are we talking about misintention only in regards to one of the four? O b'shtei avodot tnan. Or are we talking about it when it occurs to two, I'm going to say different avodas, two different examples? Ba'avoda achat tnan, if we're talking about it occurring in a single avoda, the Rabbi Yossi, then the issue is in regards to Rabbi Yossi. Why? Because we see elsewhere in the Gemara, the Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Af begemar dvarav adam nitpas, that a person is held by their latter statement. In other words, if he says, I'm bringing this animal as a korban X and a korban Y, according to Rabbi Yossi, the animal is to be categorized only as korban Y. Okay. The Rabbi Meir, okay, because if it were according to the view of Rabbi Meir, ha'amar tafus lashon rishon, who says that it's based on the earlier language, okay, of the person, which would imply if person bringing the korban says, I'm bringing this korban as X and Y, Rabbi Meir says, X. Okay. Oh, says the Gemara, as we'll go over just a little bit. Dilma, perhaps our issue of intent and wrong intent is based on Dilma b'shtei avodot tnan, a situation where we're talking about two acts of the avoda. Va'afilu l'Rabbi Meir, and even according to Rabbi Meir, the Amar Tfos Lashon Rishon, who says that you focus, you take on the earlier language of the person, Hani Mili ba'avoda achat, but that may only apply to one avoda. Aval b'shtei avodot, but if it's a situation where there are two different acts of avoda, modeh de mifsal, okay, he would acknowledge that that is going to render it invalid. Okay, and that's where we're going to stop right now. And we'll pick up tomorrow with Samach Aleph. Okay, and we'll see what they tell us in that discussion. Okay. Okay, everybody.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Be well.